Today's video is hopefully going to be short and sweet. It begins with a simple question. Is Bach's D major fugue from the Well-Tempered Clavier Book I an overture? Intuitively, I think the answer has to be no. It's true, the fugue is full of lots of the stylistic characteristics of an overture. For example, the dramatic, dotted rhythmic gestures that animate pretty much every part of the piece, as well as the rather fast 30-second note scalar flourishes as part of the subject. But despite these features, by definition, an overture is a piece that has its own form in at least two parts. And so, yes, we expect at the beginning of the piece a non-fugal section that indeed has all of these rhythmic characteristics of Bach's D major fugue. But then after that opening section, there will be a faster, often fugal section of the piece that probably doesn't have those rhythmic characteristics. It's almost as if, in this fugue, Bach has jammed those two sections together in a way to form one synthesized whole. So if the piece isn't an overture, what are we to make of the various overture-like features that Bach includes as part of the piece? What are we to make of the dotted rhythms? What are we to make of the 30-second note tiratas? Indeed, these are characteristics of overtures that Bach includes as integral parts of pretty much all of the pieces that he named overture. Pieces like the first movement of the D major partita for keyboard, or the 16th variation of the Goldberg variations. I think what Bach is doing here is something that he actually enjoys doing quite frequently, and that's taking stylistic features of one genre and transplanting them to the musical world of another. In this case, he's taking the stylistic hallmarks of the French overture and bringing them over to the world of fugue in the Well-Tempered Clavier. If we want to think of it this way, Bach is invoking the idea of overture in this D major fugue. Or to use slightly more theoretical language, we could say that Bach is bringing in the topic of French overture within this D major fugue. So how does this help us in playing the piece? How does knowing that Bach is invoking the idea of the French overture help us in interpreting this particular fugue? Well, as a first step, I often think it's most helpful to just play the rhythms exactly as they appear on the page. This gives us a starting point, and it doesn't sound too bad. Here's how it sounds. So that wasn't too bad, but I think there's more we can do with it. Personally, as a performer, I like to bring in elements of performance practice that will enhance our listeners' appreciation of the piece. And so in the case of this piece, I think it's important to bring in elements of performance practice related to the French overture. Even if the piece is not a French overture, incorporating elements of the performance practice helps the listener hear it as related to the idea of overture. So I think we can divide those performance practices into a couple of different categories. And the first and perhaps most basic of these categories is the idea of creating a slight lift whenever we have a dotted note, like a dotted eighth note, for example. There are lots of dotted eighth notes in this piece. If we incorporate just a little lift after each of these notes, our appreciation of the rhythm changes subtly. Instead of hearing through the piece a rhythm that goes tom, ta-tom, ta-tom, we hear a piece that goes tom, ta-tom, ta-tom, i.e., we move from hearing the piece as being something that's oriented towards the downbeat to being something that's instead activated by the upbeat. So that sounds like this. Related to that, we can also bring in the idea of overdotting. Now, overdotting has quite a long and contentious history in scholarship around performance practice. So we're going to bypass all of that for now and just find an approach that works in this piece. I think the best way to approach overdotting is not to be too mathematically precise about it. Our goal is certainly not to double dot notes, i.e. to turn all of the dotted eighth notes into double dotted eighth notes. That's not the idea. Our goal is simply to slightly lengthen each of those dotted notes so that, again, our perception of the rhythm is enhanced. So it might sound something like this. Also related to the idea of overdotting is the notion of compressing the various tirata figures we find throughout this fugue. This is a performance practice described by Quantz, among others, and the basic idea is that by waiting just a little bit of extra time before we start a really fast rhythmic figure, we can sort of crunch the notes of that rhythmic figure together and create a more dramatic, exciting, virtuosic flourish. In the case of this fugue, it's a little bit hard to manage because of the way that Bach writes the flourishes. Each of the tiratas begins on the beat and has a totally predictable number of 30-second notes to execute. So the way that I like to do this is by holding the first note of the tirata just slightly longer than notated. It allows me to sort of make up for lost time by slightly rushing through the rest of the figure. And so that sounds like this. The last element of performance practice for us to talk about is something that probably relates to every piece that Bach wrote, and that's the issue of ornamentation. In fact, there is a copy of this piece that may be from Bach's circle that has lots and lots of French ornaments littered throughout the piece. I don't think it's necessarily important to exactly reproduce those ornaments, but we can certainly include some French ornaments of our own at various points throughout the piece as a way of, again, enhancing our appreciation of the French character of this particular fugue. So we might do something like this. Of course, because this is Bach, there are so many different ways that we could possibly play this piece and have it sound fantastic. At its core, it's really great music, and it probably doesn't matter how we play it, it's still going to sound great. But for myself, I really like including these performance practice elements as a way of enhancing the French overture character of the piece, even though, as we established, it is not really a French overture.